This is breaking at 6. A massive federal takedown in the Mississippi Delta. 20 people indicted in an alleged conspiracy ring, including 2 sheriffs, several police officers, and a former state trooper. The charges target what investigators call a deep network of corruption.
Thanks for joining Action News 5 at 10. I'm Joy Redman. An FBI operation ended in dozens arrested, including police officers, sheriff's deputies, and 2 sheriffs in the Mississippi Delta.
The encrypted text message was intercepted at 2:14 a.m. It read, "The audits are starting. Wipe the servers." The recipient was a phone registered to a shell corporation in Delaware. The sender's location pinged from a building 3 blocks from Minneapolis City Hall. For 19 months, a joint task force between the FBI, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the U.S. Attorney's Office had been mapping a financial network that stretched from municipal contracts to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. At the center of it all was a public figure whose name appeared on proclamations, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and community fundraisers. But federal investigators had another file, one filled with wire transfers, falsified invoices, and coded communications that told a very different story. The operation began not with a raid, but with a spreadsheet. A junior auditor in the city's procurement office noticed something unusual while reviewing vendor payments for a road resurfacing project. The winning bid had come from a company called North Point Infrastructure Solutions. The contract was worth $8 million. The company had been incorporated 6 weeks before the bid was posted. It had no website, no prior projects, and its listed address was a mailbox facility in a suburban strip mall next to a dry cleaner and a check cashing store. The auditor flagged it. The flag went to a supervisor. The supervisor sent it to the Inspector General's office. 3 days later, the Inspector General forwarded the file to the FBI Minneapolis field office with a single-line email. "You need to see this." Special Agent Kara Lindholm had spent 12 years investigating public corruption. She'd seen embezzlement schemes, kickback rings, and bid rigging operations that had sent aldermen, county commissioners, and state legislators to federal prison. But when she opened the North Point file, she knew this was different. The invoices were too clean. The payment schedules were too precise. The approval signatures were dated with suspicious consistency. Someone with access to the system had engineered this from the inside. Her team started pulling records. They subpoenaed bank statements, cross-referenced business filings, and traced the ownership structure of North Point Infrastructure Solutions. What they found was a matryoshka doll of corporate entities. North Point was owned by Summit Capital Holdings, which was owned by Lakeview Ventures LLC, which was owned by a trust registered in the British Virgin Islands. The beneficial owner of that trust was a law firm in Minneapolis, and that law firm had one client who accounted for 90% of its billable hours: the public figure. Agent Lindholm built her case the way federal investigators always do: methodically, quietly, and with an obsessive attention to detail. Her team established a wire room in an unmarked office building on the outskirts of the city, near the airport, where the hum of planes overhead provided acoustic cover. They installed monitoring equipment, authorized by a federal judge under Title III wiretap provisions. They tracked financial flows through SWIFT codes and correspondent banking networks. They identified shell companies in Delaware, Nevada, Wyoming, and South Dakota. They mapped the money. The war room became the operational heart of the investigation. The walls were covered with flowcharts showing the movement of funds. Red lines connected the public figure to the shell companies. Blue lines traced the contracts. Yellow sticky notes marked dates when payments were made, always timed to coincide with city budget cycles to avoid scrutiny. 3 forensic accountants worked rotating shifts, comparing ledgers, flagging anomalies, building the financial narrative that would eventually be presented to a grand jury. The public figure had used their position to steer 14 municipal contracts to fraudulent vendors over a 4-year period. The contracts covered everything from snow removal services to IT infrastructure upgrades to landscaping for public parks. Each vendor was a phantom, Each invoice was inflated by 30 to 40%. The excess funds were funneled through the shell company network, converted into cashier's checks, and deposited into accounts controlled by the public figure and their associates. The total theft exceeded $22 million. But the money was only part of the story. The forensic accountants discovered that the fraudulent snow removal contract had resulted in neighborhoods on the city's north side going unplowed during a severe winter storm in January 2022. Emergency vehicles couldn't reach homes. Ambulances were delayed by snow-clogged streets. An elderly woman died of a heart attack while paramedics were stuck 3 blocks away, their vehicle unable to navigate the uncleared roads. The IT contract had been for cybersecurity upgrades to the city's emergency dispatch system. The work was never done. When a ransomware attack hit the system 8 months later, the city paid $300,000 to restore access. Families calling 911 during that outage faced wait times exceeding 12 minutes. A house fire spread unchecked because the initial call was lost in the system backlog. Agent Lindholm knew that corruption cases often hinge on a single piece of evidence that transforms circumstantial patterns into undeniable proof. For her, that evidence came in the form of an insider. A paralegal at the law firm managing the shell companies had grown uneasy. She'd noticed discrepancies in the trust documents. She'd overheard phone calls that didn't sound like ordinary legal work. She'd seen emails with subject lines that made her stomach turn. She reached out to a friend who worked for the U.S. Attorney's Office. That friend made a phone call. The paralegal became a cooperating witness. She provided the task force with internal emails, wire transfer confirmations, and encrypted chat logs. One email chain was particularly damning. It showed the public figure instructing the law firm to create distance between their name and the vendor payments. Another message discussed timing the contract approvals to avoid overlap with city council budget hearings. A third laid out a payment schedule designed to stay just under the thresholds that would trigger automatic state audits. The precision was chilling. Every step had been calculated. The public figure believed they had built a system that was invisible. What they didn't know was that every call, every text, every email was being intercepted and analyzed by a team of federal agents who had done this hundreds of times before. The wiretaps captured conversations about concealing financial records. They captured instructions to alter invoices. They captured moments of panic when auditors started asking questions. One intercepted call stood out. The public figure was speaking to an associate, someone who managed the day-to-day operations of the shell companies. The associate was worried. They're looking at North Point. What if they trace it back? The public figure's response was calm, almost detached. They won't. We've layered it too well. Just stick to the story. That recording would later be played in court. The jury would hear the confidence, the calculated deception, the absolute certainty that they were untouchable. By the time the task force was ready to move, they had amassed more than 11,000 pages of financial records, 47 hours of intercepted communications, and testimony from 6 cooperating witnesses. Agent Lindholm presented the case to a federal grand jury over the course of 3 days. She walked them through the shell company structure. She showed them the invoices and the wire transfers. She played excerpts from the wiretapped calls. The grand jury returned a sealed indictment charging the public figure with wire fraud, money laundering, theft of government funds, and conspiracy to commit bribery. The arrest was planned for a Thursday morning. Agents coordinated with the U.S. Marshals Service to ensure a smooth apprehension with minimal public disruption. But Agent Lindholm wanted something more. She wanted the public figure to understand the totality of what they had done. She wanted them to see the evidence. She wanted them to know that the walls they thought were impenetrable had been dismantled piece by piece. At 8:47 a.m., Agent Lindholm and 3 other agents walked into the public figure's office in City Hall. The office was elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Mississippi River, framed commendations on the walls, and a mahogany desk polished to a mirror shine. The public figure looked up from a meeting agenda, smiling with the practiced warmth of someone who had spent a career managing public perception. They were reviewing notes for a community outreach event scheduled for the following week. Agent Lindholm placed her credentials on the desk. "We need a moment of your time." The smile faltered. The public figure glanced at the door, then back at the agents. "What is this about?" Agent Lindholm didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened a leather binder and began removing documents. Wire transfer logs showing payments from North Point to Summit Capital. Bank statements from accounts in the Cayman Islands. Invoices from North Point Infrastructure Solutions and Summit Capital Holdings with approval signatures that matched the public figure's handwriting. Emails with subject lines like "Payment Schedule Update" and "Contract Approval Timeline." She laid them out one by one across the mahogany surface, overlapping edges creating a mosaic of financial fraud. The paper covered the desk completely, a physical representation of years of deception. These are the records of 14 contracts you approved between 2020 and 2024. Each one was awarded to a vendor you controlled through shell companies. The total amount stolen from the city is $22 million. She placed another document on top of the pile. "This is your sealed federal indictment." The public figure's face drained of color. Their hands, which had been resting casually on the desk, began to tremble. They opened their mouth to speak, but no words came out. Their eyes moved across the documents, recognizing signatures, dates, amounts. The enormity of what they were seeing settled in. Agent Lindholm leaned forward. "You used your office to steal from the people who elected you, and in the process, you put lives at risk. People died because emergency services couldn't function. Families lost their sense of safety because the systems they trusted were compromised. That's not just fraud. That's betrayal." The arrest was quiet. No handcuffs in the hallway, no perp walk for the cameras. The public figure was escorted through a side exit that opened into an underground parking garage, placed in an unmarked vehicle, and driven to the federal courthouse for initial appearance. By noon, the indictment was unsealed. By evening, every major news outlet in the state was covering the story. The headlines varied, but the shock was universal. The trial took place 7 months later in the U.S. District Court for the District of Minnesota. The prosecution presented a case built on financial records, intercepted communications, and the testimony of cooperating witnesses. The defense argued that the public figure had been misled by advisors, that they had no direct knowledge of the fraudulent contracts, that the complexity of municipal procurement made oversight difficult. They portrayed their client as a victim of trusted associates who had exploited their position. The jury didn't buy it. They saw the emails. They heard the wiretapped calls. They reviewed the financial records that showed direct control over the shell companies. They deliberated for 11 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge addressed the courtroom. Public service is a position of trust. The defendant violated that trust in the most egregious way imaginable, stealing millions of dollars meant to serve the community and endangering lives through neglect and greed. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a sustained, calculated scheme that lasted years. The sentence was 14 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release and full restitution of the stolen funds. But the story didn't end with the conviction. Federal investigators continued tracing the network. They identified 3 city contractors who had knowingly participated in the scheme, inflating their own invoices and kicking back a percentage to the shell companies. All 3 were charged. 2 pleaded guilty and received sentences ranging from 3 to 5 years. The third went to trial and was convicted. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division pursued the financial trail across state lines and international borders. They seized assets totaling $9 million, including luxury vehicles, real estate holdings in Arizona and Florida, and offshore accounts. It wasn't enough to cover the full restitution, but it was a start. The seized properties were auctioned. The proceeds were returned to the city's general fund, and in the neighborhoods that had been neglected because of the fraudulent contracts, the city began making repairs. The snow removal budget was audited and restructured. New vendors were vetted through a transparent bidding process overseen by an independent review board. The emergency dispatch system received the cybersecurity upgrades it should have had years earlier. Community leaders held town halls to discuss accountability and transparency. Trust, once broken, is not easily rebuilt. But the work began. The case became a training example at the FBI Academy in Quantico. Agent Lindholm was invited to present on the investigative techniques her team had used: the financial mapping, the wiretap protocols, the coordination between federal and local agencies, and the importance of building a narrative that juries could follow. She always ended her presentations the same way. Corruption isn't just about the money. It's about the trust that gets broken and the people who suffer because of it. Our job is to restore that trust by holding the corrupt accountable. What would you have done if you'd noticed those irregularities in the vendor payments? Would you have flagged them or assumed someone else was watching? That question matters because oversight depends on people willing to ask uncomfortable questions. The public figure is currently serving their sentence at a federal correctional institution in Wisconsin. Their name has been removed from the plaques and proclamations they once cherished. The office with the mahogany desk and river view now belongs to someone else. The framed commendations were taken down and replaced with landscape photography. The city continues its work of rebuilding trust, one transparent contract at a time. In the war room where the investigation unfolded, the flowcharts have been taken down, the sticky notes have been filed away. But Agent Lindholm keeps one item on her desk: a printed copy of that 2:14 a.m. text message. The audits are starting. Wipe the servers. It's a reminder that corruption often reveals itself in moments of panic, when the careful construction begins to crumble. Remember, this story is a work of fiction created for educational and entertainment purposes. If you found this compelling, share your thoughts on what real accountability looks like in your community. Thanks for watching.